This is the actual process of creating a carbon credit. You've decided, okay, the carbon market's something I want to have a look at. There's something I can do about it. I've got some opportunities within the carbon market. I can see the opportunities clearly that there's going to be good money in it. How do I actually generate the carbon credit? Well, to me, the first step is to check the project eligibility and viability. You don't have to check the viability if you don't, but as land use managers or land managers, I suggest you do check it and see if it is a viable land use as opposed to your current land uses or alternative land uses. But you must check the eligibility. Does it fit within the scope of the CFI? Is it on the positive list? Is there a methodology? Can I do it? If there isn't a methodology and it fits everything else, I can write a methodology. And then you can compare your land uses and management practices. And if all that stacks up, okay, we move to the next step where you can register as an eligible entity. And this is for people who want to do it themselves. There's lots of different ways to enter the market, but I'm just assuming that people have got the nous and the wherewithal to do it themselves. And you prepare the documentation to be applied to be a registered offset entity. No cost in this apart from your time and going through the process of filling out some documentation. And you prepare that, you submit it to the administrator. At the same time, you can actually open your magical account, and that magical account is where you store your carbon credits. It's called the Australian National Registry of Environmental Units, and it just has, basically, it's a database of certificates, which are those electronic, those digits. Once you've got that through that process, you can then move on to the next process of registering a project. You can't register a project unless you're an eligible entity, what we call an eligible offset entity, and you've passed the good bloke test to make sure you're not a fraud or a bankrupt. This is where the bulk of your work is going to be. This is where the bulk of the paperwork and bulk of the activity will occur. When you decide to register a project, then you have to bring everything together in what I call a project plan. And in that project plan, you have your maps, your models, your documentation, how you're going to report it, how you're going to monitor it, how you're going to undertake the activity. Because remember, essentially what we're selling is air. All right, so we need these airtight systems about how we actually calculate how much air we're going to be selling. Also, if you're doing sequestration, you have to obtain your notification of consent. If you're leasing the property owner has to confirm it. Your notification is put on title and you conform with all the statutory plans. Once you've done all that process, you submit it to the project to the scheme administrator and they'll assess it. They'll have a look at it and say, well, is it in the eligibility criteria? And the checklist goes, maybe a page, 2 pages of tick, tick, tick. Monitor and report on your project. This is when you're actually implementing the project. When you're actually undertaking the activity, you need to monitor it. All right, for example, under the permanent environmental planning, you have to record how much fuel you've used, the type of fuel you've used, and what the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with that fuel use for managing the project. All right, so it might be fertiliser efficiency, it might be, well, how much fertiliser do I use, what will my yield be? For example, with fertiliser efficiency, it's okay to say, well, I'm using less fertiliser, but yeah, one of the eligibility criteria is you can't reduce your yield. All right, so you can't just say, instead of getting 20 bags to the acre, I'm not using any fertiliser, give me carbon credits, but I'm only getting 5 bags to the acre or 2 bags to the acre. That's not eligible. You have to maintain your yield and reduce your fertiliser. So you've got to get more efficient rather than just using less. And when you get into this and you're actually implementing your project, you have to monitor it. You have to go through and say, well, how much fertiliser did I use or not use? How high are the trees? How are they growing? How much manure did I take off the piggery? How much effluent did we use? How much methane was generated? How much did we convert to CO2? How do we know that the system continued to work? And you go through this process, and then annually, once a year at least, or anything out to 5 years, you have to prepare a report for the CFI administrator and submit that report. But importantly, before you get your credits issued, you have to have it verified by an independent third party. And that independent third party is someone who has been approved by the government to actually undertake the activity. So that is someone who's on the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting System panel of approved auditors. So you have to have it, and there's going to be a cost involved in that. All right, and you're going to have to cover that cost. And one of the reasons they've spread it out to 5 years is you can report between 1 and 5 years, is so that you can spread the cost over a longer period of time. Particularly with trees where you plant them, you have a small sequestration at the start. If you went and got it verified, the cost is going to be similar to doing it in 5 years' time. But because you've only got a little bit of carbon that's been grown, you'll actually, the cost of verification per tonne of carbon is going to be quite high. But if you do it over 5 years, your cost of verification per tonne of carbon is going to come right down. So they give you a little bit of flexibility there. Then once you've actually gone through that, you send it all in and you apply for issuance of credits from the CFI administrator. They'll check the report, check the verifiers report, so it's all good, fantastic. How many credits did you want? We'll keep our 5%. There's the rest of your carbon credits. They're in your registry. At that point, they're free and proper property. You can do whatever you want with them. You can trade them. You can leave them in the registry. You can surrender them yourself and claim carbon neutral wheat or wool or beef or whatever it might be. So once you get to that point with one that's been issued, you can do what you like. And it's important to know that you don't have to sell them, all right? Unless you've entered an agreement to pre-sell them, they're yours. If they're in your account, they're yours. They do not expire, all right? Every certificate will be stamped with the first year of use, which will be the year they're credited or the year they're issued, and that's it. They don't expire. You can sell them at any point in the future if you wish. But importantly, if you've got them and you've decided you're going to create them but you're not sure if you want to sell them, you have a forestry project, for example, and the forest burns down and you decide, well, you know, that wasn't a good venture. I'm not very happy with that. I'd rather go back to cropping that area. If you've got the certificates in your registry, you can just hand them back and go back to your old land use. Because once you've handed the certificates back, there is no longer any issued certificates associated with that parcel of land. You don't have to keep the carbon on it. And this is where the termination and transfer comes into it, and compliance. If you do want to transfer your property to someone else and they don't want the carbon sequestration project in it, there are ways to get out of it. So even though we have this 100-year rule, you can terminate and you can transfer. You can transfer scheme obligations to somebody else if you sell the property and they decide they want to take on the obligation and often the benefit, or you can actually go to market, buy carbon credits and extinguish your liability. So there are ways around it. It is not necessarily a permanent activity, although we do like to stress that it is. Some of the other key points is when you're doing this, if I go and plant my trees and I know they're going to grow to a certain size over 100 years and I say, right, I've done this activity, there's 500 tonnes going to be there one day. I don't get that 500 tonnes. I only get the carbon as it grows or after I've stopped it being emitted. It is accrual accounting. It is after the event, after I've reported it and had it verified. You can report from 12 months to 5 years, as I mentioned. You can also export your land sector credits. You can actually put these out into the international market. You don't have to sell them within Australia. The international market in 2010 for mandatory and voluntary carbon was estimated at $140 billion. It's a big market. And I think it's going to get a lot bigger in the future. It depends a lot on the price of carbon. But we can export them. One of the big issues with carbon sequestration, or not even carbon sequestration, with carbon markets, is that it's not driven by hunger in the belly, it's not driven by the need for raw materials, it's not driven by the need to put clothes on people's back. It's driven by policy constructs, right? It's a policy decision by the government, and that's what creates the market. So the markets are developing all over the world. It's not just Australia that has a market. European Union emissions trading scheme started in 2005 and worth $60 billion a year. But they don't accept all carbon credit types. They won't accept forestry credits because of that risk of reversal. So when you start to think about where can I make these activities, if you're thinking about the export market, you need to think about, again, which market am I going to sell it to? California, the 8th biggest economy in the world, is starting a carbon trade at the end of the year. South Korea's just passed the legislation. South Africa's got legislation on the table. India charges a carbon tax, or a coal tax. So it is happening all over the world. And if you want to look at how you're going to export them, you need to start thinking about, well, where can I sell them? So if you're doing forestry, it's unlikely you'll sell them to any mandatory market in the world. We'll see that change over time. EU ETS has said we won't take them before 2020, but if you start looking at things like enteric fermentation or methane reduction, because they're a permanent abatement and there's no risk of reversal in those, they're more likely to be sold overseas. And it was only a couple of weeks after the Clean Energy Future legislation passed that the head of the EU ETS, Connie Hergand, was over here discussing the links and the fungibility between the Australian market and the European market. And if you remember those integrity principles where we say, you know, it's got to be internationally consistent, the whole idea is so that we do have this global trading scheme, all right, so we can start selling carbon internationally. And what a lot of people don't realise is that we hear a lot of talk about Copenhagen and how after Copenhagen the whole thing went downhill. In Durban last year, at the end of 2011, the Conference of Parties of the Constitutive Parties of the Nations to the Kyoto Protocol agreed that by 2015 they will have the framework for an international binding emissions reduction agreement. That includes America, China, India and Brazil. And they will have that in place and operating by 2020. And what will happen is we'll see a dramatic increase in the uptake of carbon at that point. I mentioned earlier the differences in the markets. Again, just thinking through what you need to do. These are very small, prices are very low. The coalition policy, which is a direct action policy, and I don't know if it was mentioned, but the Carbon Farming Initiative has bipartisan approval. The coalition policy, if anyone wants to look at it, the direct action plan, there's a leaf on the front, will be using the Carbon Farming Initiative as the backbone of its policy. It will be expanded to include other industrial manufacturing facilities, but carbon farming's definitely in it. And they've got about $32.2 billion that they're going to use. So all I want to say is that the Carbon Farming Initiative will continue no matter what happens to the carbon tax.